Hello everyone, welcome to biology. I am Ms. Hussein. I will be your instructor for this year. Love to see everyone. Thank you everyone for showing up. I see we have a full class. Let me first tell you a little bit about myself. I have 3 kids. My eldest is 18. She started college this year. My second is 15. He's going into 10th grade. And my youngest, she's 11, going into 6th grade. So why don't we start off our class by you telling me a little bit about yourself. Tell me your full name, your middle school, and maybe any hobbies you may have. So let's start off with, I think it's Sarah. Sarah, why don't you tell me your full name, middle school, and hobbies? All right, thank you everyone for sharing. I appreciate it. So we're going to start off with something not too heavy, a little bit light. We're going to talk about food chains and food webs. And if you get a chance, ecological pyramids. All right. So what is a food chain? So a food chain simply talks about how energy flows in an ecosystem, right? So it's the energy flow in an ecosystem in a one-way process. So as you can see here, the sun is the primary source of energy. Always, the sun's the primary source of energy. And then the sun's energy is captured by plants, which can use the sun's energy through the process of photosynthesis and turn it into food energy. And then the caterpillar eats the plant, and then the frog eats the caterpillar, and then the eagle eats the frog. And important to know is the direction of the arrows. These arrows they point to where the energy is being transferred. So the energy goes from the sun to the plant, from the plant to the locust. So always it's important to know the energy, the arrow points to where the energy flows to. So plants are called producers because they can create their own food, they produce their own food. Animals are consumers because they cannot make their own food, they must consume or eat plants or even other animals to get their energy. Now let's look at this thing called trophic levels. Trophic levels just means energy. So we've talked about producers, we've touched on producers, we've touched on consumers. Now we're going to introduce another term, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Don't worry, it's just very simple. So let's focus on here. This is called an energy pyramid. And the energy pyramid just shows how much energy there is in this whole food chain, in this whole ecosystem. So at the bottom, you have plants, which are producers because they capture the energy from the sun and they make their own food. And then you have primary consumers because they're the first to eat. So primary consumers are the first ones to eat the plants. Then you have secondary consumers. They're the ones second to eat. Then you have tertiary consumers. They're the third ones to eat. So first ones, second, third. And what's important to know about this pyramid is that, again, the base is the biggest, so there's the most energy here. Then there's even less energy available here. Then there's even less, and there's even less. So if you look in this energy pyramid, most of the organisms are plants, and then you have the least amount of organisms as the tertiary consumers. Now let's focus on this side here. Producers, herbivores. Herbivores are organisms that can only eat plants. Then you have your primary carnivores. Primary carnivores are the first ones to eat meat. So carnivore meaning meat eater, primary being first. And then you have secondary ones. So secondary meaning second ones to eat meat. Also, we have something called decomposers. All decomposers do is they break down dead organisms, and they break it down back into the soil. So it releases the nutrients back into the soil. So decomposers are primarily bacteria and fungi. So there's different types of food chains. One is a food chain, a grazing food chain, and another, this is an example for a grazing food chain, where it's primarily plants that form the basis of a grazing food chain. I will come back to this later. Another one is a detritus food chain, where dead organic matter or dead plants and animals form the base of this food chain. We'll come back to these topics later. So what are the significance of a food chain? So importantly to know is that a food chain helps us understand the feeding relationship and the interaction between organisms and the ecosystem. And the feeding relationship is just simply who eats who, what eats what. So it helps us understand how energy flows in the ecosystem. Also important is to understand recently, something for us to think about also is that how toxic substances will accumulate in an ecosystem. So usually you have let's go back to the slide here, this one here. So if there's some kind of toxic material in the producers, right, they will tend to accumulate in the tertiary consumers. So you'd see an accumulation or a large amount of toxicity in these tertiary consumers. This has become very important in the pharmacy industry recently, because we wanted to know that if there's pollution, you can look at these tertiary consumers and see how they've been affected by the pollution. So now we're going to move on to food webs. So what is a food web? So basically we talked about a food chain being one line of the sun and some organisms eating it. But it's one line, it's linear. So a food web now is just simply a network or several food chains put together. And that's all it is, several food chains that are connected together. So here, as always, we have our plants. Plants are always the producers. They're always at the bottom of the food chain or food web. And now we have two animals here. We have this mouse and this rabbit. These are the primary consumers. And then the snake will be the secondary consumer. And then you have this eagle being the tertiary consumer. And it's the same thing on this side. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. So, and they're basically these food webs linked together, these food chains, linked together to form a food web. And this is actually realistically what you have more in an environment. You have a food web, which is different food chains connected together. These are some things we'll come back to. There are different types of food webs. There are many different types of food webs. Some of what we'll look at today include soil food web, aquatic or water food web in a forest, food web in a grassland, food web, and terrestrial just meaning land, aquatic meaning water. So this is a food web that you'd find in the land or in the ground. So you'd have the plant and the different organisms that eat off the plant, Then we have a marine or water food web. Then we have a food web in the forest. So let's just take a faster look at this one. You have here the green plant, which is a producer. Then you have the goat, which is the primary consumer or the herbivore. The goat will eat the plant. And then you have the goat will be eaten by the lion, which will be with the secondary consumer, or the goat could be eaten by this jackal. In this case, the jackal will be the secondary consumer. You can also look at plant producer, be eaten by the rabbit, the primary consumer, which could be eaten by the wildcat, which would be the secondary consumer, which could be eaten by the lion, which would be the tertiary. So first primary, second tertiary, second secondary, third tertiary. All right, and again, the first one being the producer. And what's missing here? Anybody knows what's missing here? You can raise your hand. All right, in case you didn't get it, the first thing missing here is the sun. I should have included the picture of the sun here because the sun is always the first source of energy. This is another food web. So what is the significance of food web? So for food webs distinguish levels of producers and consumers by identifying and defining the importance of animal relationships and food sources, beginning with primary producers such as plants, and then we also see where insects and herbivores play a role in it. Food webs are important tools to understand that plants are the foundation of all ecosystems. And lastly, but I'm gonna just skip to this one here, is that food webs provide an idea of how stable an ecosystem is. So if there are many components or many organisms in a food web, the more stable that food web is. If there are few organisms in the food web, then that ecosystem is not very stable, because that means that small changes will lead to big effects. Whereas if you have many organisms in the food web, uh, small changes will have small effects, because there are many other organisms for them to compensate. But in a food web where you have a limited amount of organisms, one small change can have very profound effects. So with that, I'm going to stop. Just want to review what are some of the things we talked about. We talked about producers. Producers are plants because they are able to capture the energy of the sun and turn that into food via the process of photosynthesis. We talked about consumers. They're the ones that actually eat. And we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary consumers. We talked about decomposers. Decomposers break down dead stuff, break it down and return the nutrients back to the soil. We talked about food chains, which are simply different we talked about food webs, which are several food chains being connected together. Again, let me repeat that. Food webs, which are several food chains connected together. We talked about how energy is transferred, the different energy, how energy is how energy is the highest at the bottom in the energy pyramid. The most energy is available at the bottom and the least at the top. And we had talked about the importance of understanding food webs, because the more organisms there are in a food web, the more stable an ecosystem is. Any questions so far? All right, with that, we're going to wrap up. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about food webs and food change and some of the slides we didn't go over, and we'll answer any questions you may have thought of by tonight. All right, so with that, everybody take care, have a good night, and looking forward to see everybody tomorrow. Bye-bye.